Hi, my name is Melanie Velasco, and today I will be going over my essay from Dr. Campbell's class about the Spanish-American War. The questions that we had to answer was, what specifically did each author argue in the source? How did they support their argument? Why ultimately did the United States invade and occupy the Philippines? For my introduction, the American victory in the Spanish-American War in 1898 led to the United States receiving ownership over the Philippines. This new territory of imperial power caused the United States to shift away from its principles and morals as a country. The invasion and control over the Philippines caused debate on whether this possession was a noble duty or a forcefully taking control over the country. The United States claimed that taking over the Philippines was to help the Filipinos and improve them as a country. But the actions of the Spanish-American proved it was more about greed and power rather than freedom. For my first paragraph, I'll be talking about Reverend Charles G. Ames' point of view. He opposed that the purchase and imperialist policy was unnecessary, since it betrayed Americans' values and endangered the U.S. security. He claimed that the first questionable duty that the United States did was that they weren't loyal to Cuba, but since they laid out much stress on the fact that the suffering was at our very doors in Cuba. This quote can be found on the first page right here, but they intervened in the Spanish territory right away. So that was a questionable action that the United States did. It also explains that the U.S. only had two options when governing the Philippines. One was to rule with consent, meaning that they would be treating the Philippines as equals with their whites. But this means that this would create 7 million Mayas and Negritos and Chinamen for fellow citizens and joint rulers of this republic. This quote can be found on the first page as well, right here. Meaning that Americans wouldn't accept this since it would be 7 million non-whites that they would be sharing in a control agreement of government. But their second option was rule without consent, meaning that by military occupation by force, that is, by the Spanish method. This quote can be found on the first page as well, right here. This meant that they would be using the same methods that ended the Spanish-American War, so they wouldn't be doing neither of these options, since it would result into giving up the republic, for we abandoned its fundamental principle, even while boasting of its name. This quote can be found on the second page, right here. But, so, the reason for the United States taking the decision to control over the Philippines was that they wanted to shift towards imperialists and to build an overseas empire, and the U.S. thought that this was the way to do it. For my second paragraph is going to be about Jacob Gold Sherman's point of view. His point of view was that he justified American control, assuring that the U.S. power was necessary due to the Philippines' lack of government experience, since the Philippines were made out of multiple tribes, meaning that their loyalty is still of the tribe type, meaning that they would always be siding with their tribe, even if it contradicts what the country's wants and needs. This quote could be found on the 5th page of the Sherman doc, right here. But the U.S. did not trust them enough to rule for themselves, since the report illustrated that the power of the self-government cannot be assumed without considerable previous training. This quote can be found on the 5th page as well, right here. Throughout the document, it shows that they wanted to improve the Philippines, but couldn't trust them enough since they didn't have the experience in the mindset of the U.S. That's what they thought. But it also showed that the U.S. was aware over the actions that they were doing to control over the Philippines, because it would lead to a potential trading center, since it stated that it had rich agriculture and forest product. This quote can be found on the 7th page of the Sherman doc, right here. So, the United States reassured that controlling over the Philippines was not a choice, since they received this ownership by Spain when the Spain surrendered the islands when they won. but receiving this ownership, they were placed with high responsibilities and obligations. This quote can be found on the second page of the Sherman Doc right here. This new ownership, it determined that it could not abandon the country because it would dictate the national honor for giving up. This quote can be found on the 6th page right here. Because they thought that if they left the Philippines by themselves, that it wouldn't be able to survive, and it would end up in chaos, and it would eventually have other countries intervening, and it would divide the country more, using this quote that I supported, and the eventual division of the islands among them. This quote can be found on the 6th page as well, right here. For my next paragraph, I'll be talking about Henry Lodge's point of view. Lodge justified the American control based on the necessity of territorial expansion and military strength to secure a future global power. Since he really emphasized that the U.S. had a record of conquest, colonization, and territory expansion unequaled by any people in the 19th century. This quote can be found on the 2nd page right here. But many arguments arose of this expansion that the U.S. wanted to do, but Lodge claimed that the monarch doctrine established the foundational principles of American foreign relations that kept the Europe out of U.S. business. So the expansion was necessary so the U.S. could be able to achieve outworks essential to the defense of its chattel. This quote can be found on the 2nd page as well, right here. He supported this policy by demanding that the U.S. needed to build a strong navy, strong enough to give protection to Americans in every quarter of the globe. This quote can be found on the 3rd page, right here. Even though this article was written in 1895, he justified the control that the U.S. needed to do to prove that it was a great nations of the world. The United States must not fall out of line of march. This quote can be found on the 3rd page as well, right here. For my next paragraph, I'll be talking about Albert Beveridge's point of view. Beveridge justified control through racial destiny and religion, since he stated that it is racial. God has not been preparing the English-speaking and Teutonic peoples for thousands of years for nothing. This quote can be found on the 6th page, right here. This demonstrates to the public that the Americans were the chosen ones, since this higher power, God, picked them specifically to do this job, showing that they were the better group compared to the Philippines. He also uses the Declaration of Independence as support of his reason that the Americans were the better group, and since the Declaration of Independence was made by self-governing men for self-governing men. This quote can be found on the 5th page, right here. Since this document was made by past ancestors of the United States, that was towards to have a high-level government, supporting that they had proof that they were the better country, since they had documents to prove it that they were successful in self-governing. The United States control over the Philippines was just purely about the American way of governing and the religious beliefs, since they thought they were the better governing state, since they had history and documents to prove it, and God on their side. For my next paragraph, I'll be talking about Benjamin O. Flower's point of view. Flower opposed the war, and since he called it cruel. He called it cruel, unjust war of subjection or criminal aggression. This quote can be found on the 3rd page right here. He talks about the different methods that the American soldiers used against the Philippines, and explained that these methods dehumanizes them to the same level as the Spanish. He also argued that the reversion to the brutal spirit that made the days of the Spanish Inquisition the darkest page in the history of Christian civilization. This quote can be found on the 1st page, right here. He explains that these brutal actions that they were doing to taking over the Philippines haven't happened in the longest time in Christian history since the Spanish. He explains that if the war continued this way, it would end up affecting them back home, bringing it back to the United States. Some claims that show these warnings coming true is the tortured death of Private Edward C. Richards, since he was found dead, tied, and ice dumped over his head since he disregarded an order of the superior officer. This quote can be found on the second page right here. It shows that his warnings were coming true and that it was coming back home if the government soldiers were keep acting like this. He also explains that the reason for the United States taking over the Philippines, it was to shift in U.S. policy away from isolation to have a global influence, because it believed that it was trying to exercise America's tremendous potential for the international influence. This quote can be found on the first page right here. For my next paragraph, I'll be talking about William Jennings Bryan's point of view. Bryan opposed the decision based on moral law, warning that the imperialism would harm the U.S. and rebuke its foundational principles. He explained that if the United States continued this way of doing these dehumanizing actions, it cannot repel the moral law or escape punishment decreed for the violation of human rights. This quote can be found on the first page right here. He explains that by continuing imperialism, the U.S. would repute its principles upon which the nation rests. Well, it was like the foundation of what the U.S. was all about and how they grew as a country. This quote can be found on the first page right here. He also talks about that if the U.S. would change its methods from force to reason to substitute of force for justification, this substitution will undermine its glory of this powerful nation, since the U.S. is the most potential influence in the world. This quote can be found on the second page right here. He also talks about that these methods that they were doing to the Philippines, that he feared that the common citizens would be the first to suffer when the methods of imperialism are applied to our own country, our own government. This quote can be found on the third page right here. So he explains that the U.S. taking control over the Philippines, it was because they didn't want to miss an opportunity to secure this powerful world power that they had and claimed to be the most powerful country. So gaining world power would help the U.S. enter into international policies. This quote can be found on the second page right here. Entering international policies would help improve the commercial interest in the Philippines and spread Americans' religious beliefs. That will be all for my essay. Thank you.